Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I'll be walking you guys through the final boss of Abberus on normal and heroic difficulty, Scale Commander Sarkareth. I'll go through all three phases of this boss fight, including what abilities you're going to be faced with in each, how we dealt with them on our week 1 heroic kill, as well as just our general fight strategy. So let's get right into it here with phase 1, which lasts either 1 minute and 50 seconds or until the boss hits 60% health, whichever comes first. Shortly into this phase, the boss will debuff all players with a pressing howl, and this is just a debuff that will amplify the effect of 3 of the other boss abilities, and if you ever get hit by any of those abilities, it'll remove your stack and then deal a small hit of shadow damage to the entire raid via Echoing Howl. This ability also has a small knockback attached to it when it's initially applied, so just be careful that you don't get knocked off the platform right at the beginning of the fight. Now you will want to remove all of these debuffs because of the interaction this has with the Glittering Surge ability. This happens twice over the course of the entire phase, once right at the beginning before Howl actually goes out, and then once again right at the end at about 1:40, just before the transition into P2, and this just deals raid damage every second for 8 seconds over the course of the channel, but if any player still has a pressing Howl on them when this goes off, they'll get the Dazzled debuff, dealing heavy arcane damage to them every second for 12 seconds and stunning them for that entire duration. Most likely this is either lethal or just very scary in general, and it's something you want to avoid. That means you have about 1:20 or so to make sure that your entire raid steps in one of the other 2 amplified abilities to remove that oppressing howl debuff. That's either the random target frontal in Searing Breath or the random target line attack in Mass Disintegrate. For Searing Breath, as I said, it's a frontal targeted at a random player. This will pulse 3 times as well, and then each pulse will deal a hit of fire damage and apply a stacking 12-second magic dot, so it is dispellable. If this is the ability that you get hit by that clears your oppressing howl, you will also get the seared dot on you, and this just ticks for a small amount of fire damage every second, and this will last until P2. For Mass Disintegrate, this is a line attack aimed at a few random players from an image that Sarkareth places on the ground, and this will shoot out after 6 seconds, dealing a hit of arcane damage to anyone in the path. This does mean it is possible to be hit by multiple of these at one time, so make sure that the targets of them spread enough so that the beams don't overlap. If your howl gets cleared by this ability, it also leaves a dot on you called Disintegrated, though this one ticks for moderate arcane damage every 5 seconds, and on top of that, it also reduces your speed by 25%, again lasting until P2. Between the 2 of these abilities, it does seem more ideal to clear by eating a single hit of that Searing Breath ability, but honestly, the more important thing here in general is just to make sure that you clear sometime throughout this phase. Neither is going to have a major impact. In terms of how we did this clear, we split our raid in half. We did 2 clears. We did a ranged and melee, but any kind of split in half will be fine, and we did it on the first and the second breath, where the first group went in the first breath, second group, second breath, and then we were done. And then we were able to commit raid CDs here in the process because they aren't going to be really needed for P2, so you can commit all of your raid CDs stacked on these 2 clears to make them safe, and then they'll be back in P3 whenever you need them. Things like Spirit Link, AMZ, Barrier, they're great here because you can be stacked, but also if you have those other abilities like Rally, like Aura Mastery, those will get you by just fine. Plus, there's upside of clearing early on in the phase because if anyone accidentally misses a clear, they still have time on later Disintegrates and Breaths to clear before that final Glittering Surge. When it comes to the other abilities in this first phase, the main one that affects positioning is the Scorching Bombs. These spawn on random ranged players only, and this deals pulsing damage to anyone within 10 yards for 12 seconds, and then it explodes for raid damage, applying a stacking 5-second dot to everyone, and then leaving behind a burning ground puddle as area denial. Because these are always spawned on ranged players, you're able to bait these away from the boss, so what we did was use the small circle in the middle of the room here, with the ranged baiting the puddles on the outside edge of the platform outside of that circle, while the tanks and melee slowly moved around counterclockwise or clockwise, whichever you prefer. We use counterclockwise just to give more space to the ranged as they filled in the platform behind the stack with fire. Having space is especially important on Heroic, as throughout this phase there's going to be just a constant barrage of drifting ember swirlies falling from the sky, and these will deal heavy fire damage and knock back anyone who gets hit by the 4-yard swirly, so you want to make sure you avoid them. For tanks in this phase, the debuff is Burning Claws. This is a big physical hit that applies a 27-second long fire dot that ticks every second, and then on expiration releases a Burning Blast to the raid, dealing 15% of the damage you took from that dot portion to the entire raid. You want to just taunt off at 1 stack here and make sure that you have decent consistent mitigation on this dot, staggering your DRs, spamming any absorbs available to you, as well as any damage absorb actually counts as being fully mitigated when it comes to that final damage calculation. Note that this ability is quite frequent as well, so you will actually be taunting the boss back while you still have a few seconds left on your previous debuff, but there's no damage amp built in here, so it's not a big deal. Feel free to do that taunt, you're just fine. As mentioned earlier, once you do push the boss to 60% or a minute 50 has passed, the boss will jump towards the giant mirror on the south side of the room and begin casting Void Empowerment. This will constantly apply the Oblivion dot to the entire raid, which is a stacking 25-second shadow dot that will send players down to the Void Realm version of this platform whenever they reach 10 stacks, which does happen to every player on the phase transition here, but you'll also be able to gain these Oblivion stacks just throughout the fight by getting hit by various abilities, but we'll talk about that in a second. When you actually go down into the Void Realm, the boss and your entire party disappears from your view, so you can't interact with them at all, and you'll be debuffed with Emptiness Between Stars, as a 99% damage reduction for 20 seconds that will kill you on expiration. To remove this debuff, you need to recover 3 fragments of your mind, which are just the 3 small white circles that spawn somewhere in this area. As soon as you soak that 3rd circle, you'll immediately be sent back to the regular realm wherever you're currently standing, so just be aware, especially later on in the fight. Sometimes this can have some bad overlaps with other abilities, so you may need to wait a few seconds before you pop back up. Just make sure you go up before that 20-second debuff expiration. While you're waiting down here, though, you can also run over some of the many astral flares just kind of littering the Void Realm. And these are just small white shards, and they'll give you a stacking 5% haste and 10% move speed buff for 23 seconds. You can get a total of 10 stacks here. Definitely something you want to stack up whenever you end up down in the Void Realm. Just make sure, again, you head back up before that emptiness debuff expires. Don't die to greed. In terms of abilities in the second phase, one of the most important ones is Abyssal Breath, which the boss will aim at a random player and then breathe a line towards them, leaving behind a couple void puddles on the impact location, as well as a few Null Glimmer adds. These adds will just try to cast Blasting Scream, which is a kickable ability that deals a hit of arcane damage and interrupts spellcasting, so you'll definitely want to make sure none of these go off. These guys are also fully CCable, so knockbacks, stuns, all things you can use. They'll also gain a stack of Ebonmite whenever Sarkareth uses any ability in this phase, and that'll give them a stacking 15% damage and move speed increase. But then at 5 stacks of this buff, they become immune to interrupts and CC, so at that point, you're kind of in trouble, so you want to make sure you kill them before this point. On Heroic, these adds also spawn with the Rescind buff, causing them to heal for 4% of their health every second, and while you can damage through this buff, you can also make your life a bit easier by using one of the boss mechanics, Desolate Blossom. These are void zones that spawn on random melee players, applying both a healing absorb and stacks of that Oblivion dot to anyone who touches them, while at the same time removing any Rescind buffs from any adds that pass through them. To make use of these on Heroic, we had our melee players immediately stack up on the adds as soon as they spawned, just baited the blossoms directly on top of them, and then made sure everyone got out of those areas before they actually spawned while leaving the adds in there. And then if we ever missed an add touching those void blossoms, we used like a knock or had a tank kite them through it just to get rid of that buff from them. At the same time, in this phase, you'll need a couple players assigned to be dealing with the void bombs that spawn. These bombs spawn on random ranged players. They have a 20-second timer when they spawn, and they'll explode after that timer in a void surge, which deals massive damage to the raid over 4 seconds. To prevent this, you can have a player step on the bomb, causing them to take ticking damage while they carry it, and then have that same player stand in those Death Blossom puddles that I talked about earlier to be sent down into the Void Realm by reaching 10 stacks of that Oblivion dot. And down here, the bomb will just kind of dissipate instead of murdering your raid. We assigned a couple range DPS to this job, but basically any 2 players that you trust at living and doing mechanics are good choices. The tank mechanic in this phase transforms into Void Claws, which is another physical hit with a dot, though this one is a shadow dot and it ticks every 2 seconds for 18 seconds, and in the process also reduces your healing received by 25% for the duration. When this dot expires, it'll deal a Void Blast in a 20-yard AoE around you, and this deals 40% of the dot damage taken to anyone in that circle, so you want to make sure that the tank runs this debuff out before it expires to avoid that additional raid damage. In addition to all of these abilities, on Heroic you'll also need to deal with the magic debuff Infinite Duress, which goes out on a single player and deals ticking shadow damage every 3 seconds for 30 seconds, and when removed will trigger a raid hit and knockback called Dread, where the knockback is centered on the debuffed player. Note that the player themselves will not be knocked back, instead they actually get knocked straight up into the air, which is important for later. In terms of positioning for this, we had the debuffed player move to the outer ring of the platform and then just dispelled them there right after the inactive tank's Void Claws debuff expired, just to ensure that you didn't knock that tank off the platform. You could maybe do this detonation earlier, but the one problem will be potentially knocking people into that tank's AoE, so just be careful with that overlap. All non-debuffed players will also want to make sure that they don't get knocked into a Void Blossom, and your bomb carriers will also want to make sure that they don't come up just as you're like dispelling someone, especially if their soul fragment is in like a bad spot on the edge of the platform. Once you bring the boss down to 40% HP, or after roughly 4 minutes into the fight, Phase 3 will begin with the boss running back to that giant window on the south side of the platform, this time shattering it in the process. He'll then run to the tank and use Cosmic Ascension, a massive 30-yard AoE that deals heavy shadow damage and knocks back anyone hit. Upon detonation, this spawns those Null Glimmer adds from P2, and also throws several asteroids at random players that deal big ticking damage to anyone who stands near them. Notably, on Heroic, you have no way of removing the healing buff on the ads in this phase, so you really need to make sure that you focus them down. When it comes to asteroids, you are able to actually remove them from the field if you want to with another boss mechanic, Embrace of Nothingness, though I don't recommend you do so, but I'll explain that later. This ability will go out on a random player. It'll deal massive damage after 8 seconds, which is split between all players hit, and then it'll leave behind a 12-yard black hole, which will pull in any asteroids and then deal a secondary big hit to anyone who's still inside of it. Make sure you have as many players as you can soak this initial hit, then move out of the black hole that forms, or if it's on a player with an immunity, this can also be just taken out of the raid entirely and just immuned off to mitigate that raid damage. Now, as I said, you don't actually want to hit all of the asteroids with this ability, as they actually are required to save you from an ability Sarkareth casts throughout this phase, a massive hit called Scouring Eternity. This deals 1,000,000 damage and knocks back any players not actively hiding behind one of these formations, and I really want to emphasize here that the explosion, this detonation, is centered from not the boss, but the giant mirror, the shattered window that we talked about on the south side of the room. The explosion always comes from that window, meaning always the north side of the asteroids is the safe side of them, and this safe area is also denoted by a long white line, which is longer actually than the animation shows, but just make sure you're standing in those lines and ideally not in that AoE actually around the asteroids themselves. The more asteroids you have up, the easier it is for your raid to find a safe spot to stand in. Now, this isn't without a downside, as this ability also has a secondary unavoidable hit in Astral Eruption, which deals increasing raid damage based on the number of asteroids currently active. So this can get quite large later on in the fight as you get more and more asteroids, especially if you're not clearing any of them, but that's kind of where the raid CDs come in handy, like Rally or Mastery, those kind of things. Don't be afraid to commit those abilities here while you're hiding behind the asteroids. If you do find that you're taking too much damage from them, you can opt to clear some of the asteroids. Just make sure you still have enough that you can hide behind the Scouring Eternity cast. When it comes to dealing with Scouring Eternity itself, we found the best strategy to be to bait those asteroid spawns on the south side of the room, as close to that mirror, which is the source of the explosion, as possible, to give players the most possible safe room during the cast. This means that whenever Cosmic Ascension is cast, you'll want to run towards the south side of the platform to bait those asteroid spawns that happen immediately after. This gets a bit more interesting on Heroic, as that Infinite Duress knockback debuff comes out around the same time as these Cosmic Ascension casts, but you can actually use it to your advantage here. We tank the boss in the middle of the room, with the boss facing the north side and the raid on the south side on the boss's back. When Infinite Duress goes out, we had that player run in front of the boss, and then as soon as that Cosmic Ascension AoE appeared, we dispelled the debuff player to shoot the entire raid except the debuff player to the southern end of the platform, where they can easily bait the asteroids near the mirror. Note that the player that has Infinite Duress gets knocked up, not knocked back, so either they'll need to commit a massive DR or immunity, which can be inconsistent, so instead what we actually did was assigned our Evoker to rescue them to the south end of the platform immediately after the dispel every single time. If you don't have an evoker, you can instead just choose to have the player hold this debuff and have players manually run to the south side, bait the asteroids, and then dispel them to get back to the boss in the center of the room instead. Either works, so don't worry about it. Do whatever is good for your raid. In terms of other mechanics in this phase, you still have to deal with those void bombs we talked about in P2, so make sure you have players managing these, and there's also a constant barrage of swirlies called Motes of Oblivion for the remainder of the fight that start in P3, and these will deal shadow damage and apply 5 stacks of that Oblivion dot to anyone hit, so you'll need to stand in these motes to actually go down to the Void Realm in this phase. The tank debuff has changed once again, now becoming Void Slash. Very similar to the P2 debuff, except now it applies to anyone in front of the boss, so it's a frontal cone. It also now lasts for 21 seconds, and on expiration does that same Void Blast, but the 40% of damage taken from the dot is not a 20-yard AoE, it just hits everyone in the raid no matter how far away from the tank they are. You can get around this, however, as the debuff tank can get hit by those emotes we just talked about. It can get sent down to the Void Realm just like the bomb players, and they can just detonate down there harmlessly. Doing so massively reduces the raid damage in this phase, so I highly recommend it, and it really opens you up to never clear asteroids and just commit all your raid CDs to those asteroid explosions. The final mechanic of this phase is Hurtling Barrage, which will shoot a line through the platform at random players, dealing shadow damage to anyone hit, kind of similar to those mass disintegrate lines in P1, but these lines will appear on the edge of the platform instead of from an image near the middle, so you really have to be looking towards the edges to see where that beam is coming from. Often this overlaps with the Embrace of Nothingness soak, so players targeted by the Hurtling Barrage will want to make sure that they aren't in that soak, as double cleaving the raid is definitely bad. To recap our overall strategy for this phase, we take the boss in the middle of the room, facing the north side of the platform, with the rest of the raid towards the south side to avoid anyone getting frontaled. Whenever Cosmic Ascension is cast, the entire raid would either run to the south side on normal, or be knocked to the south side by that Infinite Duress Dispel on heroic, and this is just to ensure that those asteroids spawn as close to that mirror on the south side of the room as possible for those Scour Eternity casts. To do this on heroic, the Infinite Duress player needs to make sure they step in front of the boss before they get dispelled, which is fine as this will never overlap with a tank frontal, and then either pop a major defensive or be rescued by an evoker to the south side. Adds that spawn in this phase are always the highest priority, so make sure you swap to them. Also, make sure you either immunity or have as many people as possible soak that Embrace of Nothingness slam, keeping multiple asteroids outside of this hit so that you have a safe space for that Scouring Eternity. Players targeted by Hurtling Barrage should never be in the soak and should do their best to get these lines way away from the rest of the raid. Players assigned to dealing with the Void Bombs and tanks with the active debuff should step in the moat swirlies on the ground to be sent into the Void Realm, otherwise players will want to avoid these moats as they're just extra raid damage. From there, just slam this boss and collect your loot. Hopefully though, this video helped you guys get your head of the curve, and if it did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like it, including guides for every single Mythic boss, as well as advanced Mythic Plus guides for pushing high keys. If you ever want to check out my own progression, you can come stop by my Twitch channel at Tactics and say hi. If you have any questions, you can ask them there or put them down in the comments below. I do want to give a quick shout out to all of my supporters over on Patreon. It really does mean a lot. Otherwise, thanks everyone so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.